Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 6th, 2011, and my guest is Frank Rose, author and writer for Wired Magazine. His latest book is The Art of Immersion: How the Digital Generation is Remaking Hollywood, Madison Avenue, and the Way We Tell Stories. Frank, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ. Nice to be here.
Our topic today is your book, The Art of Immersion, which I found utterly fascinating, learned a great deal from it, and found it very provocative as an economic storyteller. Your argument is that storytelling is changing, along with advertising, movies, TV, and the web. How? What is the art of immersion?
Right. Well, the idea is essentially, the focus of the book is on how the Internet is changing storytelling. And the idea is really that every time a new medium comes along, it takes people 20 or 30 years to figure out what to do with it, to figure out the grammar of that medium. The motion picture camera was invented around 1890, and it was really about 1915 before the grammar of cinema, all of the things that we take for granted now, like cuts and point-of-view shots and fades and pans, all of those things were consolidated into the first what we would recognize as feature films. Birth of a Nation being the real landmark. It wasn't the first film that had these characteristics, but it was the first film to use all of them, and it was the one that people settled on. That really made a difference. I think we're not quite there yet with the Internet, but we can see the outlines of what is happening, of what's starting to emerge. And it's very, very different from the mass media that we've been used to for the past 150 years.
How so?
Essentially, mass media is it's broadcasting, whether it's in print or over the air or whatever. It's one to many. And it's just a function of economics. Around 1850, 1860, it became much more economical to start newspapers that would reach a large number of people. And this same pattern, obviously obtained in broadcasting once radio and then television came along. And the trade-off was that it was essentially one-way communication. There was very little way for people to write back. And of course, you had letters to the editor and so forth, but the bandwidth, so to speak, was infinitely smaller. So it was essentially a one-way form of communication. The Internet is not only two-way; it's multi-way. It enables us to talk to each other, about what we're seeing, what we're viewing, what we're experiencing. And that puts us all in a very different place. It means that, among other things, essentially the boundaries are blurred. All of the boundaries that we took for granted for much of the past 100 years, the boundaries between advertising and entertainment, for example, the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction, the boundaries between the audience and the author. So as these things blur, we're entering essentially a new kind of media world.
Yeah, I've believed now for a while that advertisers are some of the best storytellers, and that's becoming increasingly obvious. And in fact, I've started to believe that it's almost all storytelling. It's what we as economists do. We do a lot of storytelling, much of it ex post, after the fact, justification for various philosophical views rather than real science. That's a common theme on this program. But one of the things your book does is it makes you realize how pervasive storytelling is, now fundamentally human an act it is. We like telling stories. We like listening to stories. And one thing your book made me think about is we like retelling them. And when we retell them, we tell them with our own additions, subtractions. We retell jokes all the time. It's the most primitive form of it. But the audience communication among each other is really one of the things that your book brings out. And the participatory nature. And you give a marvelous example of 19th century participation with the serial novel. Talk about that as a primitive example of how Dickens was influenced in his writing.
Yes. I was really fascinated by that example as I got deeper and deeper into it. Essentially, Dickens was as a young writer, as a young novelist, was very influenced by the technology of the day, and so were his publishers. And the situation was that in England in the 1830s, you had large numbers of people who had recently migrated to cities. They were increasing numbers of them were literate, far more than had been the case even 50 years before. And at the same time, you had fairly rapid advances in transportation with the railroads, which guaranteed a distribution system, and printing presses and the manufacture of paper. And at the same time, this sort of newly literate potential audience did not have a lot of money, so it wasn't very easy for them to, for most of them to go out and actually buy a book. But they could afford, a shilling for a small portion of a book. And so what happened was that novelists like Dickens published their books in monthly installments, generally, occasionally even in weekly installments. And this meant that it was the writing of the novel was very much an iterative process. It was ongoing as the novel was being published. And so this made it possible for readers to, make their feelings known. And Dickens was, I think, perhaps even more than other writers at the time, was very responsive to what his readers said. He didn't always follow their suggestions. No. With Little Nell in the old curiosity shop, as it became increasingly apparent that she was going to meet an untimely demise, there was, sort of a great hue and cry. He was certainly a good enough storyteller to know that
her days were numbered.
Exactly. But in other cases where the narrative was faltering a bit, he paid much more attention.
Yeah, it's actually I hadn't thought of this until you just mentioned it. In Oliver Twist, the character of Fagin, who's Jewish, is not a very flattering portrait, and Dickens took a lot of heat for that. So in his later book, Our Mutual Friend, which is one of it actually is my favorite Dickens. I'm a big Dickens fan. Our Mutual Friend, which I consider his best book, there's a Jewish hero in it, and I think Dickens was, upset that his fans were upset. So he responded. But of course, as you point out, the bandwidth wasn't very big. You couldn't really some people could let him know how they felt. What has changed is not just the ability of the audience to influence the story, but as you often point out in your book, the ability of the audience to write the story, not in the way that we used to think it would happen, as you point out, not the audience picks the ending, but really right. How the characters evolve in response to the audience's sometimes tweeting in the name of a character, is a marvelous example in the book. But let's talk about some of the immersive aspects, which is another part we really haven't touched on, which is not just the ability to get into a story, but get into a story in a way today that you couldn't imagine before the technology of the web came along. Why don't you talk, for example, about notsoserious.com, which I didn't know about, the campaign in advance of the release of The Dark Knight.
Yes, this was what's known as an alternate reality game. This was a particularly large-scale example that took place over a period of, I believe, about 18 months. And essentially, the purpose of it was to, create this experience that kind of started and largely played out online, but also in the real world and elsewhere, that would familiarize people with the story and the characters of The Dark Knight, in particular with Heath Ledger as the Joker, and would essentially sort of build enthusiasm and interest in the movie in advance of its release. So on one level, it was a marketing campaign. On another level, and this is another example of the blurring that I mentioned earlier, it was a story in itself, or actually a whole series of stories. It was developed by a company called 42 Entertainment, which is based in Pasadena, and headed by a woman named Susan Bonds, who is sort of, interestingly enough, educated and worked at first as a systems engineer, and spent quite a bit of time at Walt Disney Imagineering before she took up this. It's kind of a particularly intriguing example of storytelling because it really makes it possible or encourages the audience to sort of discover and tell the story themselves, to tell the story online to each other. For example, there was one segment of the story where there were a whole series of clues online that led people to a series of bakeries in various cities around the U.S. And when they got to the bakery, the first person to get to the bakery in each of these cities, when they got there, they were presented with a cake, and on the icing to the cake was written a phone number and the words "call me." And so when they called, the cake started ringing, and so people would obviously kind of cut into the cake to see what was going on, and inside the cake they found a sealed plastic pouch with a cell phone and a series of instructions. And this led to a whole new series of events that unfolded, and eventually led people to a series of screenings at cities around the country of the first, I think it was the first 7 minutes of the film, in which the Heath Ledger character is introduced.
Yeah, it was a rather remarkable. You mentioned at the beginning of the book, and then I think toward the end. I think when you went into the bakery, you had to ask for a package for Robin Banks, which is kind of a pun. I missed it the first time, but since that's how the movie opens, with a bank robbery,
right?
So that's a cheap joke for such a clever, extraordinarily complex set of clues. One of the things that happens in these stories that you chronicle is the crowdsourcing, the wisdom of crowds, the emergent smartness of the ecosystem of these fans. Any one of them, of course, has trouble solving these, but as a group, they solve them with lightning speed sometimes, to the surprise of the designers. I gave one example where they expected some puzzle to last for either weeks or months, and they solved it in the first day, and they're off and running, and all of a sudden it's out of control. In this case, do we have any idea how many people were involved in exploring that game that was created in advance of The Dark Knight? Because the numbers are extraordinary. Sure.
Ultimately,
I don't remember.
It was about 11 million people around the world.
Just stunning. Now, another example you talk about, and again, that's one level of immersion, right? Before the movie comes out, you're into Christopher Nolan, or you're into the Batman series, or you just like puzzles or games, and so you start playing along with this. But one of the examples that you talked about, particularly interesting, was the TV series Lost. So I'm one of the only people in the world who hasn't seen all of them, all the episodes. I saw a few of them when it first came out. But a lot of people, not most, but a lot of people got immersed in Lost. So give us some examples of that immersion and the products that got created along the way.
Sure. Well, the thing about Lost was it was really a different kind of television show. And what made it different was not the sort of gimmicks like the smoke monster and the polar bear and all of these things. Those were just kind of icing. What really made it different was that it wasn't explained. In the entire history of television, until quite recently, just the last few years, the whole idea behind the show has been to make it really simple, to make it completely understandable so that no one ever gets confused.
Yeah, dumb it down for a mass audience. PBS, that's sophisticated. That's where you can watch Shakespeare, where you'd have to work a little bit at it. But sitcoms and other things they're supposed to be easy. Right,
exactly. And Lost took exactly the opposite tack. And the result was that, it might not have worked 10 years ago, quite frankly. But now, with everybody online, we live in an entirely different world. So the result was that people got increasingly intrigued by the essentially puzzle-like nature of the show. And they tended to go online to find out things about it. And the show developed a sort of fanatical following, in part because precisely because it was so difficult to figure out. There was a great example that I came across of a guy in Anchorage, Alaska, who watched the entire first season on DVD with his girlfriend in the couple of nights leading up to the opening episode of Season 2. And then he watched the opening episode of Season 2, and something completely unexpected happened. And he thought, what is going on here? So he did what comes naturally at this point, which is to go online and try to find out some information about it. But there wasn't really much information to be found, so he did the other thing that's becoming increasingly natural, which is he started his own wiki. This became Lostpedia. It was essentially a Wikipedia about Lost, and it now has tens of thousands of entries. It's in about 23 different languages, around the world, and it's become such a phenomenon that occasionally the people who were producing the show would themselves consult it when their resident continuity guru was not available.
And you talk about, again, a sort of a modern version of the Dickens story. When they created a couple characters that people didn't like, they killed them off pretty quickly.
Right.
Again, a little bit of audience feedback affecting the story. But the other part of that, of course, is that Lostpedia and videos that people create and make. They start using the characters in ways that probably often violate copyright laws. You talk in the book, but often the creators say, "This is good. Let it run."
Yeah, I think that's the more enlightened attitude toward it, because the truth is that people really want to inhabit stories that they love. If it's a story that you really care about, you want to get into it as deeply as possible. And for many people, that means, as you mentioned earlier, retelling the story yourself. And so for years, decades in fact, you had a sort of underground fan fiction community that particularly flourished around certain science fiction movies and TV series, Star Trek and Star Wars, I guess, being the ultimate examples, but there were certainly many others. And with the coming of the internet, all of these things surfaced because what had been published in very small scale fanzines suddenly became available online for anybody to see. And this caused a fair amount of panic, certainly in Hollywood and as well as in the publishing community and elsewhere. But I think the really interesting example is what's happened in Japan, where manga series, comic series, developed the same kind of following and the same kind of intense involvement in the form of fan fiction. And the publishers eventually learned to just sort of look the other way and let it happen, because they realized that it's not as if it's not as if the fan fiction is taking something away from the existing series. It's only increasing interest in it. It's hardly plagiarism. It may be technically a violation of copyright law, but frankly, it's to the benefit of all concerned. So I think companies in the U.S. and in Europe are just beginning to reach this conclusion. A particularly interesting example was what happened to Warner Brothers when it started to take on teenage and preteen fans of the Harry Potter series in advance of the release of the first movie. This was, they started sending cease and desist letters to 12 and 13-year-olds who had set up websites that, used names like HarryPotter.com. And, fan sites, of course. And so these kids got these letters, and a lot of them were, pretty freaked out about it, and so were their parents.
Understandable.
And, where once it might have been, they wouldn't have had a voice, that's not the case anymore. It developed into a huge public relations disaster for Warner Brothers, and they finally had to back off on it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question about whether the vision of an author often might be a little different than the vision of a conglomerate, right? Who owns Hamlet? Well, after a while, we all do,
right.
But maybe for some period of time, the author ought to be able to protect Hamlet from becoming a slacker surfer dude. But it's a fascinating question, and in a way, it's kind of an irrelevant question because the internet's making it so hard to enforce those cease and desist orders, even if you wanted to. But as you point out, increasingly people don't want to. I'm going to go back to loss for just 1 second. One of the remarkable things about it is the size of it. You mentioned there's a lot of articles, but I think you said the article on Jack Shepherd's over 100 pages, or roughly 100 pages. It's not just that, there's lots of information about it. There's scientific studies of airplane crashes. There's expansive imaginings about what things might stand for that aren't clear. You even mentioned there's an economics page. I went and looked at it. Wasn't very excited by it. I blogged on it at my blog, Cafe Hayek. I'll put a link up to that because I encourage people to maybe give us some alternative visions of the economics of the show than the one that's up there. But that's just one example. And one thing that struck me that I don't think you talk about as an economist that struck me is the amount of time. It's one thing to say, when Star Wars came out, a lot of people got into it, and that spawned novels based on Star Wars, action figures that kids played with, sequels, obviously, all kinds of things that used time. And people went to conventions in costumes and all that. But the level of hobbydom, or whatever you want to call it, the use of leisure to immerse yourself in these stories is just – it's an extraordinary statement about our humanity, our standard of living, the amount of time that people devote to these beloved characters and stories, which are not real, which doesn't matter really at all,
right.
Is one of the fascinating things about this whole phenomenon. It couldn't have happened in 1500, not because of the technology, obviously they're related, but you'd starve to death. The fact that people can devote hundreds and hundreds of hours personally and that millions can do this says something about modern life that is deep and profound.
No, it's quite true, I think. Clay Shirky, who I believe you've interviewed in the past, has the theory that that television arrived just in time to soak up the excess leisure time that was produced by the invention of vacuum cleaners and dishwashers and other labor-saving devices. And I think This is essentially the next iteration of that, kind of the next step, so to speak. And the difference is that television was, it encouraged passivity, obviously, that gave rise to the whole phrase couch potato. And this is something entirely different. I mean, there are obviously still shows that people like to just sort of veg out and watch, but there are many other shows that large numbers of people like to become increasingly involved in, and as well as books, movies, and so forth. Really, a story in any form, and what's really happening here, I think, is that we're putting our excess time, our excess leisure time to use. Could we, be using that time to solve all the world's problems? Well, maybe, but frankly, football games and the like exist for the same the same purposes.
Yes, they do.
Just to soak up our attention, to provide a diversion,
to stimulate, to amuse, to divert. But it's
exactly.
different. But what your book made me think a lot about isn't the sort of divert and the passing of time in a pleasant way, which is what that's the least attractive way to describe it. Mm-hmm. A football game, right? A football game is actually, for a serious fan, something much different than a couch potato experience. It's immersive in a different way. You pore over the statistics. You go over the history of your team's success and failures. You agonize over it. You talk to your buddies, your family, right? It is immersive before the net in a non-technological way, but increasingly technological. Now fantasy football's changed that. But what I found provocative is that it's very easy to dismiss football or Star Wars or Lost as, quote, oh, that's just entertainment. But it has real effects on us as human beings, and not in a bad way, but there's an emotional experience that happens there. Some of it can be destructive, of course. You're rooting for your team to rip the head off of another team's player. It's not so attractive. There's a bloodlust there that you're vicariously appealing to there. But in fiction, which is what storytelling's about, you're experiencing things vicariously that are healthy. They're imaginative. They're part of the human experience that you can't touch directly, and you're experiencing them indirectly. You're exploring the universe. You're doing things that are no longer possible or never were possible for you as an individual. So I found, and you talk about some of the neuroscience of that, it's a remarkable thing.
Yes, I certainly think so, and I certainly agree with you about football or other sports, by the way. I'm not myself a huge sports fan, but that's neither here nor there. What's fascinating about sports is that there's precisely the same mechanism at work as there is in fictional stories that are presented in a way that you can become immersed in them, which is that with football, or with any sort of ball game, you are essentially able to tell your own story. It presents you with this sort of, tableau with an almost infinite number of variables, in the players, the points, the stats, and so forth. And out of that, you pick your own story. You pick the details and create your own story. And that's, in a sense, not unlike what happens with fan fiction. The novel or the TV series or whatever it is that you become, more or less obsessed with, really becomes something that you use to generate stories of your own. It's the same basic mechanism at work. And there's a couple of very interesting factors here. I mean, you mentioned neuroscience, and I think, that's something I became increasingly fascinated by as I worked on the book, because we're in a time right now when, for the very first time, it's possible to get the first sort of dim outlines of how the brain works. And we certainly don't know it all yet by any means, and there are many aspects of it that are controversial, and many more aspects of it that are still unknown. But it becomes very apparent, among other things, that the whole idea of storytelling has something to do with the phenomenon of sharing. We essentially want to share information. We want to, for any number of reasons, in a sort of advanced technological society, we want to share information for pecuniary reasons. If we're, professionals, we like to, write newspaper articles or movie scripts or whatever. But there's a much deeper mechanism, I think, at work here. And what has happened is that a series of experiments that really began by accident about 20-odd years ago in a laboratory in Parma in Italy, where they were studying the brain functions of macaque monkeys. That these experiments have given rise to the idea that there are cells in the brain that are involved in rehearsing different sorts of actions. And the way they work is that if we see something that happens to somebody else, whether it's it's somebody else on the street or somebody else on TV, it's almost as if it happens to us. And this makes for a very a very close and personal relationship with the people that we see around us, even if we don't know them. And this is considered basically to be the basis of empathy, but it's also the basis of the kind of sharing that storytelling is essentially all about.
Yeah, I've remarked on the program before a phenomenon that, in a way, makes those experiments unnecessary. The fact that we cry when a fictional character dies in a book, whether it's Nell or a modern version,
right,
or a character in a movie, we can sob. And the standard argument, I think, is that we fool ourselves. We step back and we pretend that it's real, but it doesn't really matter. Something clearly biological is going on there. It's not like, let me pretend that this is unreal so I can have a good cry. I can't really help myself if the story's well told.
Right.
And so that's really what's going on. I want to comment on your football example because it for me pulls together a lot of things. I am a sports fan, and one aspect of sports is that there's a story every time, but we don't know the script, so we don't know who's going to win. So there's it's like every week, it's like watching a movie you've never seen before.
Sure.
There's that part of it. There's the rush of the biochemical rush when your team wins or falters, the depression of chemicals. And the point you made that I think really resonates with me, and I'm going to tie it into economics, is the ability to tell the story ourselves. So I'm a Red Sox fan. The Red Sox collapsed this year, which they've done before. That was often devastating to me in the past, but they've won a few World Series recently, so it's not so bad. I didn't like it. It made me. It was a bad thing for me. But what I find interesting is, and I never thought about it so clearly, is we all tell our story of why Red Sox fans all tell a story about why we lost. Oh, it was the manager's fault. See, here's what happened. Or it was the GM. He didn't have, he didn't give the staff. He didn't. My story is the starting pitching collapsed. That put pressure on the middle relief, and then they collapsed. And I'll prove it. Let me tell my story even better. I'll go get data to show you that the Red Sox led the major leagues in runs scored. And see, that's part of my story because that shows you it was the pitching and therefore, et cetera. So we do that in sports all the time, but we also, of course, do it in economics and politics. So if you're on the left, you have one story to tell about why the economy is struggling. If you're on the right, you tell a different story, and some stories are more entertaining. It's not clear that the stories are more accurate. It's very hard in economics to pin those things down, and so a lot of what we're doing is, unfortunately, fake science rather than the real thing. Let me ask you a few different questions that came up in my mind. I don't think you talked about in the book. One of the differences in immersion is gender. Men, I suspect, are much more likely to be immersed in these examples. And you give a lot of examples in the book of how video games interact with movies and stories. And men are much more likely, I suspect, to be in these immersive examples than women. Is my suspicion correct?
I'm not entirely sure. I don't really have the data on that, I'm afraid. Certainly it would appear that men tend to be more immersed in some kind of stories than women do. I mean, football would be an obvious example.
Grand Theft Auto too, I assume, which you talk about.
Sure, exactly.
I assume that's mostly men.
Right, but I think that I'm not at all sure that the idea of immersion itself is gender specific. I think it's more a matter of what kind of story it attaches to.
True.
I think that obviously there are movies that appeal more to women, or TV shows that appeal more to women than to men, and I suspect that in cases like that women are at least as capable of being immersed, so to speak. I mean, one of the examples that I use in the book of kind of fan involved storytelling is with the show Mad Men, which is obviously has been a hugely popular show especially among people in New York and other cities who have some kind of involvement or knowledge of the ad business.
Sure.
And there's a whole series of people who started tweeting as characters, in character for Betty or Don Draper or various other characters in the show, and overwhelmingly these people were people who had experience in the ad business, but also interestingly, I think most of them were women. I mean, it's obviously an anecdotal example. I can't. I'm not sure how much I can extrapolate from that, but it certainly suggests that women are as capable as men of being
of wasting large amounts of their time doing something in an alternative universe.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. I think there's an aspect of this immersive phenomenon, though, that you touch on from time to time quite a bit in the book, which is the power of reward, competition, scorekeeping, and that's what video games exploit, obviously. Video games that don't have winning, that don't have points, that don't have goals that you achieve, don't do very well. And for whatever reason, and I'm interviewing Roy Baumeister in a few weeks on the topic of male-female differences of this kind, but for whatever reason, men seem to find those kind of experiences more exhilarating on average. Obviously, there's women who do and men who don't. But another phenomenon in the book I wanted to ask you about, which I found fascinating, and we're doing this interview on October 6th, which is the day after the passing of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was well known as a college dropout. And at the end, I want to come back. I'm going to ask you about Steve Jobs. But right now, the thing I want to focus on is that he didn't finish college. He went to Reed for a while, dropped out, got into typography, hung out there for a while, took some things he found interesting and made his own way. There are a lot of portraits in your book of people who have done these exhilaratingly creative storytelling examples, videos, etc. I was struck by how many of them did not take the standard route to financial well-being in the U.S., which is to graduate from college and get a good job. A lot of them were kind of on the fringes of mainstream economic activity and suddenly vaulted not just to success, but to wild success. Did you notice that when you were doing those interviews?
I can't say that I thought about that consciously, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it's pretty well known, for example, that especially in the tech world, there are a lot of college dropout billionaires. Steve Jobs is
they're a dime a dozen.
Was hardly unique.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
They're a dime a dozen, yeah. But,
right, exactly.
But these aren't the standard startup people you hear about. Sergey Brin,
sure.
he finished college. He dropped out of grad school. But a lot of these people were one of them, you said, was driving a cart on the lot somewhere at 25, living at home, and suddenly he's running something, and I can't remember the details, but there's more than one.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think one really good example is Will Wright, the video game designer who is responsible for first SimCity and then later The Sims, which is one of the most successful video games in history. And, one of the two or three most successful video games in history. It's just been, it's made him and Electronic Arts a great deal of money. And it's also kind of changed the way a lot of people think about video games. Interestingly, by the way, it's one example of a game that, while it certainly has a structure that many games has, it's not really focused on points or competition. What it is focused on is model building. You're essentially, as the name implies, you're creating a simulation, and that's something that turns out to be really basic to what we're talking about. Whether it's a football game, we take our experience, we abstract it, and we tell stories about it as fans. Or whether you're playing this game and that gives rise to its own kind of stories, because you're essentially talking about what happens to you. And when people essentially become so interested in a fictional story that they want to make it their own, that's kind of what happens too. There was this fascinating exchange that I stumbled across between Henry James and Robert Louis Stevenson in, I think it was 1883, where Henry James, in a fairly well-known essay, described fiction as sort of an impression of life. And, that seems to be hard to argue with. But actually, Stevenson argued with it, and what he said was that, to quote, life is monstrous, infinite, illogical, abrupt, and poignant. A work of art, in comparison, is neat, finite, self-contained, rational, flowing, and emasculate. In other words, art is essentially an abstraction. It's a form of model building.
Now, again, I can't help but think about economics, where we have all this data and we have the complexity of a modern economy, which is literally mind-boggling, and we have to make sense of it because we want to talk about it and fix it when we think it's not going well. And so we build a model that simplifies by an enormous amount, and that is both comforting and can be dangerous. But it is, I think, for political junkies and economics junkies, it's a form of entertainment in the same way that storytelling is. It's comforting. It leads to confirmation bias of one's own worldview, and I think in economics we have to face the fact that that's a lot of what we do, and that's a lot of what people are consuming that we provide, and it's a little bit scary.
Right.
Now, one of the things that struck me, and you talked about this in the very beginning of our conversation, you said we're at the cusp, not quite at the cusp. We're not at the landmark event yet. As extraordinary as all the examples that you give in the book, and as a 57-year-old who's not immersed in pop culture, a lot of them were I didn't know about. I didn't know about Lostpedia. I didn't know about NotSoSerious.com and the Dark Knight run-up. So they're really utterly fascinating and really, really interesting. But the flip side is they're really kind of pitiful. In that I read your book on my iPad using the Kindle app, which was very pleasant. I took a lot of notes and highlights, and it was really it was a nice experience. It's fun to put it under my arm and carry it around with the other things that are on there. But I was struck, for example, when you talked about the Happiness Factory ad that Coca-Cola ran, which an ad I remember vividly and loved and found it just a beautiful thing and just fun to watch. And those of you out there, we'll put a link up to it. You can Google it, and if you want, you'll find it's easy to find. But I was struck that I had to get out of my Kindle app and go wander around on my YouTube app, that it wasn't a very seamless experience, that it should have been embedded in the text. I should have been able to touch it, and it would have popped up and played. With Lostpedia should have been on there, et cetera. As far as we've come, we have so much farther to go. So much of what's on the web is just print put up on the web.
Yeah,
it's
right.
In academic life, the gold standard's always been an interactive textbook, and yet most textbooks online are just the textbook put on in a PDF. I mean, it's a little more interactive maybe, but we've got so much more to go. So, one, react to that, and then I'd like you to speculate on where could it go? What directions might it be heading?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right. In a perfect world, the book would have had many of the e-book version of this would have had many of these things embedded in it. And frankly, it was just a matter of economics and time, which of course are kind of the same thing.
You could have built an app for your book that did that in some fashion. It'd take a long time and it's expensive.
Right, exactly. And we decided that the best thing to do would be to get the book out there as quickly as possible, since it's something that is kind of very much based on what's happening in popular culture at the moment. These things have kind of a half-life.
Right. And it's not so bad to go on my YouTube app. It's not like,
yeah, sure.
Although that distraction and challenge, trivial as it is, will in a year or 5 be unacceptable. Right.
No, I totally agree, and I think that we're fairly rapidly entering a period where a book like this is going to look very old-fashioned, and at some point I'm sure that we'll be able to update it to accommodate all of those things. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that's a measure of where we stand right now, and certainly it would be less intrusive to have those things built in than it would be to sort of force you to go online on your laptop or whatever and explore them. But the same experience happens essentially with television right now. I mean, there are more and more studies that show that increasing numbers of people, especially young people, who are watching TV, do so with a laptop or some other device immediately next to them that they're referring to constantly. Whether they're chatting with friends who are watching the same show, whether they're looking things up.
Frank, it's not just TV. It's life.
Yeah,
the conversations are like this. You're talking to someone, they're checking their email while you're talking to them, and it's now become it's a little bit embarrassing for some people, but we're multitasking and connected. It's not just, you can always reach somebody on their cell phone. You can reach them on their cell phone while they're talking to you or text them while they're talking to you, and they look down.
Right.
It's everything.
It's true.
Anyway, I interrupted you. Sorry. Talk about where you think it might go.
Well, I think that ultimately where it's going to go is some kind of fusion of story and game, which is not really been accomplished yet. I think that is, however, what's implied in this kind of immersive, participatory form of storytelling. The problem is, it really comes down to a problem of authorship. I mean, we touched on this earlier, but the question is, whose story is it? And this was actually reflected perfectly in an exchange I had with the people who ran Lost, Damon Lindelof and Carlton Hughes, where they said that people, fans who talked to them at fan conventions and the like, had basically two opposite reactions. One was they wanted to be sure that the producers knew where the story was going. And at the same time, they wanted to have some voice in where the story was going themselves.
Slightly contradictory.
Yeah, exactly. Well, now, there are ways that you can accommodate it. I think Dickens showed how you could do that. But if there weren't a strong narrative, and if there weren't a strong author there in the first place, people wouldn't be attracted to it.
Yeah.
It's a difference between, Lost, say, and Second Life, which is a sort of online experience that has kind of fizzled out because there are no rules. You can kind of more or less do anything you want, and so what? Games, the advantage that games have over, conventional narratives is that you can be the hero. Whatever is happening, it happens to you. But there are a lot of technical limitations in game consoles and all the other devices that are involved, and those are those tend to make it feel not at all realistic. And I think it's very interesting though that the game that's come closest to being a real story is one that recently came out from Rockstar, which is the company behind Grand Theft Auto. This new game is called L.A. Noire, and it's essentially a detective story that is set in Los Angeles in the mid-1940s. And it's kind of fascinating that a detective story would make such a great narrative video game, because of course detective stories are inherently participatory in the first place. Whether it's Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple, you're always kind of looking over the detective's shoulder, right?
Yeah, sure.
And
you've got the data. In theory, you have the same data. That you've got the clues. You've got
Right. And typically what happens in a detective story is some bit of data surfaces that that you didn't have access to.
But you can imagine those data, right? That's again,
sure.
You really get into it, you start to say, well, what could I be missing that I need to,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In any case, I think where it's going is some form that hasn't really been invented yet, that very convincingly combines the participatory aspect of games with the narrative absorption of storytelling.
Yeah, when you were talking about that seeming contradiction between you want the producers of the show to know where it's going, but you also want to have a say in it, it's no fun to think that they're playing around with you, that they're leaving around clues that don't mean anything.
Sure.
You want there to be an integrity to the story that is, and it's got to be, that part to some degree has to be scripted. I'm reminded of this quote I've always loved of Faulkner's, where he says, and I think about this when I write, he says, I just follow my characters around and write down what they say.
Right.
And in a way, that's one style of writing and writing fiction. When you write fiction, you do think about your characters, and you do think about what they do in certain situations, and I think what that captures that's related to, I think, the Lost story is the integrity. There has to be some intellectual, artistic vision that has integrity, and then you want to play with it. You want to imagine where it might be going. You want to try to anticipate the ending, and so on. And that's what makes it, I think, exciting as the reader,
right.
or the audience. It's funny you mentioned Second Life. We had Edward Castronova, an academic who studies virtual alternative reality, massive multiplayer games, on the show a long time ago, and at that time, Second Life was just exploding, and it seemed to be that it would be a big success, and it was a big success for a while. But I love the way you described it, which was, well, you could do whatever you want. Well, that's a little too much like life in America in 2011, at least to some extent. In 1500, again, that had been a remarkably exciting thing. If you were going to be, if you knew your dad was a blacksmith and you were going to be a blacksmith, to imagine and be able to inhabit a world where you were something else, that'd be a lot more exciting.
Yeah.
Let's close and let's talk a little bit about Steve Jobs. I'd love to hear your thoughts on his passing.
Well, yeah,
because he's part of this story in lots of ways, right? On the edges and in the middle sometimes. And
absolutely. I mean, before years before I wrote this book, I wrote a book called West of Eden, which is about the conflict between Jobs and John Sculley, who Steve brought in to be the CEO of Apple in the early 80s, and who 2 or 3 years later ended up firing him. And Sculley fired Jobs, of course. And I thought about this quite a bit a couple of years ago when I republished the book, and therefore wanted to, I needed to think about what had happened. What was the difference between then and now? Because when Jobs was forced out of Apple in 1985, everybody celebrated the press, the tech world, the business press, of course, in particular. Everybody,
the grown-ups were going to be in charge now.
Yeah, exactly. And, it meant that Apple was going to be safe, and it would be, it could be like Hewlett-Packard. Well, nobody wants to be like Hewlett-Packard these days, do they? But
especially not if you're in the entertainment world.
Yeah, right. And anyway, but what was so intriguing to me is that I think in the 1980s we weren't ready for computers, and we certainly weren't ready for Steve. People were obviously fascinated by computers, but most of us were also pretty scared of them. And in the way that many of us are fearful of one aspect or another of the internet at this point. But we've certainly made our peace with computers, and in fact, Steve has, very much defined the world that we live in. And he started to do that way back in the 80s when he introduced the Macintosh, which contained the seeds of desktop publishing, which eventually led to blogging and all forms of social media. All of these things can, really be traced back to stuff that he was involved in as far back as the 80s, and then in the late 90s and in the current decade, really brought to fruition with a whole series of remarkable products: the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and so forth. And but we really do live in Steve's world, and it's a world that he created for us without benefit of focus groups. He didn't ask us what we wanted because he understood quite correctly that nobody knows what they want when it hasn't been invented yet.
Yeah.
And he, I think learned from his, some of the mistakes that he made in the past, but he certainly didn't become a different person. He remained as fierce and as intense as he always had been, and that inspired a number of things, but in particular a kind of loyalty among the people who worked for him. They wanted to. People really wanted to please him, and it wasn't just out of fear that he would, eviscerate them if they failed, because because he might. But they wanted to. He inspired them. He always inspired people, and inspired the people he worked for. And ultimately, he did that with all of us. And I think that's the real secret of the marketing campaign, the incredible marketing success that Apple has had. Yes, they've had good ads and great slogans and all of that, and that's a clear part of it. But somehow what they really managed to do was take that sense of inspiration and challenging people to do something and spread it to the whole populace, and not just the people who are working for you.
I'm glad you mentioned the people who work for him, because I was watching some news clip this morning about they talked about all the products he created, and as much as I respect the man, he didn't create many of them directly. He had an extraordinary team, sure. But that's not enough. It's easy to hire the smartest people. The hard part's getting them to work together, unified by a vision that he did clearly impose, not a literal vision always, but certainly a set of principles of taste, aesthetics, usability, et cetera, that were rather extraordinary. My obit on him was from Kipling. He filled the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, and his intensity of creativity, not just and his faith in himself, which of course sometimes was probably just lucky that people liked what he created. He didn't force it on us. He couldn't force it on us. It was really his will, mm-hmm. his indomitable will in the face of received wisdom is really what I think is so extraordinary about him. I remember when the iPad came out and people laughed at it. This is the iPad. He's already had the string of incredible successes. When it came out, right. People said it's just a small computer and it doesn't have a real keyboard and it's expensive and, quote, nobody needs it and only people are going to buy it are going to be these geeky fans of Apple. And, it's everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people love that toy.
Yeah, yeah.
And I enjoyed reading your book on it.
Good, thank you.
My guest today has been Frank Rose. Frank, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. Really enjoyed it.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.